Tonight, I'm taking you to 5 places in Singapore most visitors never talk about. Quiet places with strange histories and moments people still can't explain. While researching this video, I found stories that honestly gave me chills. Watch till the end. One location truly surprised me. If you enjoy real stories about mysterious and hidden places around the world, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Story 1. Old Changi Hospital. I remember the night very clearly. It was humid, quiet, and the kind of night where the air in Singapore feels heavy on your skin. A friend and I had driven toward the hill where the old hospital stands. From the road, the building already looked strange. Dark windows, broken walls, and vines crawling over the concrete like the place had been slowly swallowed by the jungle. Old Changi Hospital has a long history. It was built in the 1930s as a British military hospital. During World War II, when Japanese forces occupied Singapore, the hospital was taken over. Historical reports say prisoners and wounded soldiers were brought there, and some were tortured or executed. After the war, it returned to being a hospital, but it was finally closed in 1997. Since then, the building has been abandoned. That night, when we walked closer, the silence felt unnatural. Normally, Singapore is full of sounds, cars, insects, people. But around the hospital, the quiet felt thick. The entrance doors were broken and hanging loosely. Inside, the hallway smelled of dust and old concrete. Pieces of glass cracked under our shoes. I kept thinking about the history while walking through the corridor. Soldiers had once been carried through these same halls. Doctors had rushed between rooms, and during the war, prisoners had probably waited in fear behind some of those doors. My flashlight moved slowly across the walls. Old paint was peeling everywhere. In one room, we found rusty hospital bed frames pushed against the wall. Nothing moved, but the place felt like it still remembered something. Then, something strange happened. We were standing near a staircase that led to the upper floor. My friend was behind me when he suddenly whispered, "Did you hear that?" At first, I thought he meant the wind, but then I heard it too. A faint sound above us. Not loud, just a soft, dragging noise, like something slowly moving across the floor upstairs. We both froze. The building was supposed to be empty. No guards, no workers, nothing. Just an abandoned hospital that had been locked away for years. I remember looking at the staircase, trying to convince myself it was probably an animal or loose debris moving because of the wind. That would have been the logical explanation. But the strange part was that the air inside the hospital was completely still. The sound stopped for a moment. Then it happened again, one slow movement across the floor above us. My heart was beating harder now. Even though I tried to stay calm, the thought kept coming back. This place had seen war, fear, and death. Hundreds of people had passed through these rooms during some of the darkest moments in Singapore's history. After a few seconds, my friend quietly said, "Let's go." Neither of us argued. We walked back through the corridor, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. When we stepped outside, the night air suddenly felt normal again. Even now, I still think about that moment on the staircase. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But standing inside an abandoned wartime hospital, hearing something move in a place that should have been silent, it's a feeling that stays with you long after you leave. 2-story Bukit Brown Cemetery. The first time I went to Bukit Brown Cemetery, it was already late in the afternoon. I had heard about the place many times before. People in Singapore say it is one of the oldest cemeteries in the country, filled with thousands of graves that date back to the early 1900s. Many of the people buried there were early Chinese pioneers who helped build Singapore. But the reason I wanted to visit was not just the history. For years, locals have shared strange stories about the place, especially after sunset. When I arrived, the cemetery looked almost like a jungle. Tall trees covered the area, and thick grass grew between the old tombs. Many graves were huge stone structures with Chinese carvings and statues guarding them. Some of them looked forgotten, like no one had visited them in decades. At first, everything felt peaceful. The wind moved slowly through the trees, and the only sound I could hear was birds somewhere in the distance. I started walking deeper into the cemetery, following a narrow dirt path that curved between the graves. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Some graves had small offerings placed in front of them, bowls, incense holders, sometimes even food. It reminded me that many families still come here to respect their ancestors. Even though the place feels abandoned, it is still very important to people. By the time the sun started going down, the atmosphere changed. The shadows between the graves became darker, and the trees blocked most of the remaining light. I suddenly realized how quiet the place had become. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I thought someone else had entered the cemetery. That would have been normal. But when I stopped walking, the footsteps stopped too. For a few seconds, everything went silent again. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. Maybe I had heard leaves moving or a small animal running through the grass. So I kept walking. A few moments later, it happened again. This time, the sound was clearer. Soft footsteps behind me, stepping slowly through the grass. I turned around quickly. There was no one there, only rows of old graves and trees moving slightly in the wind. That was the moment I felt something I can't really explain. It wasn't exactly fear, but the strong feeling that I wasn't completely alone in that place. Bukit Brown Cemetery holds the remains of more than 100,000 people. Many historians say it is one of the most important heritage sites in Singapore. But when you stand there in the fading light, surrounded by graves that are more than a century old, the history starts to feel very real. I stood there for a minute, listening carefully. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, but the feeling stayed with me. Eventually, I walked back toward the entrance as the sky turned dark. The moment I reached the road, the normal sounds of the city returned. Cars passing, distant voices, life continuing as usual. But even now, whenever I think about Bukit Brown, I remember that quiet moment between the graves, when it felt like someone was walking behind me, even though no one was there.
3-story Ha Par Villa. The first time I walked into Ha Par Villa, I honestly thought it would just be a strange theme park. I had seen a few photos online of colorful statues and unusual sculptures, but standing there in person felt very different. Ha Par Villa was built in the 1930s by the brothers who created Tiger Balm. Their idea was simple. They wanted a place where people could learn about Chinese myths, morality, and the consequences of good and bad actions. So they filled the park with hundreds of statues showing stories from Chinese folklore. But the moment you enter the park, you realize something feels unsettling. The statues are everywhere. Some are huge, some are small, and many of them show very intense scenes. People being punished, demons watching from the corners, strange creatures with twisted faces. I remember walking deeper into the park, following a path that led toward the most famous attraction there, the 10 Courts of Hell. Even before entering the building, I could see visitors outside looking confused and slightly nervous. Someone near me even laughed awkwardly and said, "This place is a bit creepy." Inside, the lights were dim and the air felt heavy. The 10 Courts of Hell is a series of displays that show what happens to people in the afterlife according to Chinese beliefs. Each section represents a different court where souls are judged for their actions on earth. As I walked through the first hall, I saw statues of judges sitting on large thrones deciding the fate of the dead. Next to them were scenes showing punishments for different sins. Some statues showed souls being pushed into pits, others showed demons forcing them through painful trials. Every display had detailed figures frozen in expressions of fear or suffering. The strange thing was how quiet everyone inside the building became. Even though there were several visitors around me, nobody was talking loudly anymore. People were just slowly walking from one display to another, reading the descriptions and staring at the statues. At one point, I stopped in front of a scene where a group of demons were dragging a soul toward a punishment chamber. The statue's face looked so realistic that for a second it almost felt alive. Then, something happened that made the moment even stranger. Behind me, I suddenly heard a child's voice whisper something. It sounded like someone quietly asking a question. I turned around expecting to see a family or a group standing there, but the hallway behind me was completely empty. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps from the next room where other visitors were walking in. Maybe the voice came from there. Maybe the sound just echoed strangely through the hall. Still, the moment stayed with me. Haw Par Villa is not abandoned, and it is not a haunted building in the usual sense, but walking through those dark halls filled with scenes of judgment and punishment makes you feel something unusual. It's the kind of place where history, culture, and fear mix together. And when you finally step back outside into the bright Singapore sunlight, the silence inside those halls feels like something you just escaped from.
4-story Pulau Ubin. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at Pulau Ubin was how different it felt from the rest of Singapore. Just a short boat ride from the city, but the moment you step onto the island, everything slows down. No tall buildings, no loud traffic, just small paths, old houses, and thick forest everywhere. Pulau Ubin is one of the last places in Singapore that still shows what the country looked like many decades ago. In the past, people lived here in small villages called kampongs. Many worked in granite quarries or fishing. But over time, most families left the island, and today only a few residents remain. I went there one evening with a small camera because I wanted to explore the quieter side of the island. Tourists usually come during the day to cycle around or visit the wetlands. But as the sun started going down, the place began to feel very different. The paths became empty, the sound of insects grew louder, and the forest around the narrow roads started to feel much darker. I remember riding a rented bicycle down one of the dirt tracks that passed through a thick area of trees. The only light came from my small flashlight attached to the bike. Every few meters, the beam would catch something, an old wooden fence, a broken hut, or sometimes just tree branches moving slowly in the wind. At one point, I stopped near an abandoned quarry area. The water inside the quarry was completely still, like a black mirror under the fading light. These quarries are part of Pulau Ubin's history. Years ago, workers carved huge sections of stone out of the island, leaving deep pits that later filled with rainwater. While I stood there looking at the water, something strange happened. From somewhere inside the forest, I heard a faint sound. It was hard to explain. It sounded almost like someone moving slowly through dry leaves. At first, I thought it was probably an animal. The island has wild boars, monkeys, and other wildlife, so hearing movement in the forest isn't unusual. But the sound continued. Step, pause, step. It didn't sound like an animal running. It sounded more like someone carefully walking. I turned off the flashlight for a moment and listened. The forest became completely silent. Then suddenly the sound stopped. For a few seconds, nothing moved at all, just the dark trees around the quarry and the quiet water below. I waited, expecting to see someone come out of the forest path, but no one appeared. Maybe it really was an animal that walked away when it noticed me. That would be the most logical explanation. Still, standing alone on a quiet island surrounded by thick forest, it's easy for your mind to start imagining things. Pulau Ubin is a peaceful place with beautiful nature and deep history,
But when the sun disappears and the paths become empty, the island can feel very isolated. And sometimes, in places that quiet, even the smallest sound can make you wonder if something else is sharing the darkness with you.
5-story Pasir Ris Park. I went to Pasir Ris Park late one evening because someone once told me that the place feels completely different after sunset. During the day, it's just a normal park in Singapore. Families picnic there, people ride bicycles, and children play near the beach. Nothing about it feels strange at all. But that night, I wanted to see the other side of it. By the time I reached the park, the sky had already turned dark. The streetlights near the entrance were on, but the deeper parts of the park looked almost black between the trees. The sound of waves from the nearby sea mixed with the quiet rustling of leaves. I started walking along the path that runs near the mangrove forest. Pasir Ris Park has a long stretch of mangroves, and during the night, that area feels very isolated. The wooden boardwalk that passes through the trees was nearly empty. I remember hearing only two things clearly: the sound of insects and the slow movement of water under the mangrove roots. As I walked deeper along the boardwalk, I suddenly remembered something I had read earlier. Years ago, a tragic incident happened near this park. A young girl was murdered in the area, and the case shocked Singapore because violent crimes are extremely rare there. The story stayed in the news for a long time, and many people still remember it when they talk about Pasir Ris. Maybe that memory is what made the place feel heavier that night. Halfway down the boardwalk, I stopped for a moment and leaned against the wooden railing. The sea breeze was cool, and the mangrove trees were moving slowly in the wind. Then I heard something behind me, a soft tapping sound on the wooden boards. At first, I thought someone else had entered the walkway. That would have been normal, even at night. So I turned around expecting to see another person walking toward me. But the path behind me was empty. The lights along the boardwalk were very dim, but I could still see the entire stretch of wood leading back toward the park entrance. No one was there. I stood still for a few seconds, listening carefully. Then the tapping sound happened again. 1, 2, 3 small taps on the wooden boards. This time, it sounded like it came from somewhere near the mangrove trees beside the walkway. My first thought was that maybe a branch had fallen or some animal had climbed onto the boards. Mangroves are full of crabs, birds, and other creatures. But when I shined my phone light toward the trees, nothing moved. The water under the roots was still. The branches barely moved in the wind. For a moment, the entire area felt strangely quiet, like the park was holding its breath. I didn't stay there much longer after that. When I finally walked back toward the main path of the park, the normal sounds of the city slowly returned. Distant traffic, voices from people near the beach, and music coming from a group having a late picnic. Pasir Ris Park is still one of Singapore's most peaceful coastal parks. But that night on the empty boardwalk, with the dark mangroves around me and those strange tapping sounds in the silence, it didn't feel peaceful at all.